Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country. My name is Valerie Vandepan, and I am the managing editor at Native News Online. I am joined today by our publisher, Levi Rickert, and our special guest this week, Jared Nally. Jared is the former editor, the Indian Leader, the student newspaper at Haskell Indian Nations University, who was a recipient of the 2021 Elias Boudinot Free Press Award for a lawsuit with the school. Nally and his student newspaper staff affirmed students' free speech in a recently settled lawsuit. Today, we will discuss freedom of speech at federally operated tribal colleges and universities and how a recent Supreme Court ruling could impact student rights remedies at TCUs. Jared, welcome.
Thank you, Valerie.
So before we get started, I think it's always nice, for us reporters, we talk about freedom of the speech and freedom of the press pretty frequently, but that, it's not always a hot topic for other folks. So why don't we start with just asking, what does the freedom of speech and freedom of the press mean for Indian country, and why is it important?
Well, I guess two parts. When we talk about First Amendment rights, it's the right to dissent. Nobody's really going to challenge speech that they find agreeable or like hearing. And so the First Amendment is the right to have disagreeable speech. And I think that's really important in Indian country when some of our voices aren't what Congress wants to hear, or it doesn't benefit colonial capitalism to have our voices heard. And so I think it's really important that we value what free speech has for our communities and what having outlets in Indian country has been for our First Amendment rights, whether it's the Cherokee Phoenix or the Indian Leader. We've had publications to meet the needs of giving our communities voices.
Well said. So how is freedom of speech impeded at Haskell? What happened?
So for my issue, my rights for First Amendment speech was violated through a directive that forbade regular acts of journalism. These were retaliation for using that right to dissent. So having critical coverage of our university, of people in administrative roles in our university. And that criticism was spun as violating the school's code of student conduct, that I wasn't writing with respectful speech to these individuals or to our university, and that I had to cease ways I was gathering news information and covering topics.
So how did they retaliate against you for kind of calling attention to things that they didn't like?
So in October of 2020, I was given a directive that kind of outlined different things that I wasn't supposed to do. And it portrayed regular acts of journalism in this light to try to validate what they were doing to me. So asking questions of government offices was part of it. And so that was to keep me from doing stories and getting information from government offices, whether it was our local police department or county coroner. Those are kind of information news gathering efforts that were being stopped through the directive.
Jared, who gave you the directive?
That was the former university president, Ronald Graham.
And then speak to, did you get support from was there an advisor to the Indian Leader at Haskell, or what type of support did you get down the ladder from the president?
Yeah, so the whole time I wrote for the Indian Leader, we had an amazing advisor, Rhonda Levoldo, who was with the media comms department at Haskell. And we were able to talk to her about our coverage and the important roles that our coverage was leading up to the directive and even after the directive. So she was really instrumental in understanding what journalism was and our role. And I think as a student journalist, that directive had a huge chilling effect on somebody understanding what media is and what journalists do, because we're just figuring out that for ourselves. That's why we're student journalists. We're still in our pathways of learning. And Rhonda was really helpful in that. And then getting the support of the Native American Journalists Association and the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the Student Press Law Center. There are a lot of organizations that help support me in my work and helped me understand a little bit more about journalism and why it was important to pursue this as a First Amendment case.
And just for our viewers' awareness, Rhonda is the former president of the Native American Journalists Association, and she and I have been friends for a few years. And so you had a great advisor there, obviously. And did you really feel censored? Talk about that. How were you feeling? Obviously, you must have felt strong enough to have a lawsuit. So talk about your feelings about being censored.
Yeah, so the directive lasted a little over 90 days. And during that time, there were concerns that if I continued to write, would that impact my ability to graduate from the university? Would I be expelled? What kind of topics were okay to write about in that interim time, since I was the editor? And there were different stories that we buried because we didn't know what that reaction was going to be. And so that is kind of what censorship is that chilling effect, that if somebody can take your voice away and have adverse actions taken against you because of what you're saying or the work that you're doing, then you have to think about what does that next step need to be? Is that needing to be silent on different topics? Is that needing to pursue options of litigation? And so there's a lot of reflection, a lot of attention to the topic, which as a reporter, you're not used to being on the other side of the paper. And so it was just, I think, a really hard time to get through. And in understanding how all of that stress impacted my schoolwork in that semester.
So you filed a lawsuit, and so talk a little bit about what happened next. So you are in the situation, you're feeling censored. The school is not, the pressure is such that you're self-censoring. And I think that that's a really good point that people in media do regularly. And I think probably more than most reporters will acknowledge, depending on their outlet and what the story is. But you end up self-censoring. And you felt that chilling effect that you couldn't report on valid and important issues to the Haskell community and to Indian country. So what did you end up doing next? How did you come to feeling like you have to file a lawsuit, and how did the school respond?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, the directive was in effect for about 90 days before we got a response that they were rescinding the directive and that they acknowledged that they took an incorrect approach. And it was after that we still continued and filed a lawsuit because the same factors that were cited in the directive were still in place that allowed the abridgment of free speech. So the directive cited the Code of Student Conduct, which was restricting student free speech to circle values, which were like integrity, respect, and other laudable values for the circle acronym. And so it was really important to move this into litigation so that way we can think about future students. I think in a lot of our communities, we talk about 7-generation thinking. And that was something that we kind of applied to this case, that even if I'm about to graduate, even if the directive has been rescinded, what can we do in this moment to make sure that the student generations after me aren't going to face the same kind of consequences. And so it was really important to get the Code of Student Conduct changed and to get some of the other administrative behavior corrected, so that way this wouldn't be a reoccurring problem and concern for future writers for the publication.
And I want to note for our viewers that the Indian Leader at Haskell is the oldest tribal newspaper, student newspaper in the country, and it has won several awards through the years. So this is a strong newspaper. And Jared, so I applaud your actions and the idea that you were safeguarding freedom of speech for future journalists at the Indian Leader. I think that's pretty significant. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So you did end up filing a case, and there was a recent Supreme Court ruling that kind of got, I think, overlooked in the wave of rulings that came after it. But talk a little bit about that ruling and how it impacted your case.
Yeah, so with our case, we ended up settling with the university on several of the claims, and that's because the university was willing to meet us in those actionable outcomes of changing the Code of Student Conduct and other factors with our student bank. The one claim we didn't settle, and that was looking for appeal, is a Bivens claim against the university president. Bivens is a lawsuit that one of the outcomes was being able to seek damages for rights violations. And we're looking at having that extended to First Amendment rights violations. So for Egbert versus Boule, which was a recent Supreme Court decision, the case was looking at a First Amendment, or the parts that we were interested in were the First Amendment Bivens claims. So a brief rundown of the Supreme Court case: we have a bed and breakfast owner, Boule, who had guests on his property. Egbert, who is a border guard, didn't have a warrant but came into the property. The owner got in between the officer and one of the residents, and because of that there was a use of excessive force, and when Boule went to complain about the use of excessive force and the lack of a warrant, the officer, Egbert, went ahead and filed a bunch of complaints and buried Boule under complaints that were unfounded, whether it was an IRS complaint or talking to the tag office to get his vanity plate removed. And so
just to be clear real quick, sorry to interrupt, but didn't the officer in retaliation notify the IRS about something false about him? And the man ended up, because he had complained about this officer, he ended up with an IRS audit as a result.
Yes.
This wasn't just simple retaliation. This was like massive retaliation using other agencies of the federal government.
Yes, and so that's where we get into the First Amendment Bivens claim. Is originally he was just Boule was making a complaint to an office, and he later filed a suit because Egbert not only used excessive force against him, but then went on to retaliate against Boule's right to be able to express a complaint, and that's the First Amendment issue. And so even though our cases don't really have a lot in common, what we're looking at is, does the Supreme Court and does the government look at having a right to remedy for First Amendment violations? And so ultimately the Supreme Court overturned that, which means we don't have an avenue for appeal. But that means that in the context of a large federal office, there is no way to get a Bivens claim or receive monetary damages for First Amendment violations by federal officers. And that trickles down to to Haskell and other schools operated by federal officials that there is no way to receive damages from our administrators at Haskell. And why that is something to consider is that state-run universities and colleges, they do have the right for remedy from their officials. And so we're not in agreement with how state-run schools are and BIE-operated colleges and universities.
So basically, what this recent ruling says is that if a federal officer, for example, who's running one of the federally operated tribal colleges and universities, violates your First Amendment rights, there's no recourse for the student. Is that correct? Like, you can work to change the policies within the school, but you can't sue for damages. And because you can't sue for damages, there's no real pressure on administrators then to actually make sure to ensure your First Amendment rights.
Right. So damages operate in a way of offering remedy. So a lot of times with First Amendment claims, your chance of speaking or your opportunity to have a voice was silenced in that moment, and you can't get that back. Sometimes it comes with monetary damages. I think I was talking to you about newspaper theft and being able to get or recuperate cost if you had to run a reprint because somebody took and destroyed copies of the newspaper. So there's different things that can be incurred, different costs to a person, tangible and intangible, that damages would help alleviate. And what that also does is it dissuades government actors from engaging in censorship because there's a liability to them if they do engage. And it also encourages recipients of censorship, people who have been retaliated against. It incentivizes them to be able to restore free speech and expression by allowing them to recuperate damages. So in this case, the only outcome of our case was being able to change some policies in the university, get some language changed, and to someone that might not have been worth doing because that dragged this issue on for well over a year.
But you stuck with it, so all future Haskell students will benefit, right, from these kind of policy changes that have been made at the administrative level within the school.
I certainly hope, and I hope people understand that that's what the lawsuit was for, is for that next generation. And I think some of the takeaways that I had from watching not only my case develop and learning some of the legal support behind my work as a journalist is understanding that cases like Egbert versus Bull do have an impact on me and do have an impact at our government and schools. And I would never have paid attention to that case had it not had direct impact to me. And I think coming out of this, I would love to see more tribes involved in writing amicus briefs or being involved with Supreme Court cases that may not be directly tied to Indian country, because I feel like a lot of them would have impacts on our relationships with federal officers if we were to take an interest in whenever a federal actor was involved in these cases.
And Jared, I have written before that the U.S. Cavalry is not chasing us around anymore on horses, but our fights are really in the court system. So I appreciate your comments, and I appreciate you coming on today. Tell us what you're doing now. What's your profession? What are you doing?
Well, I am just getting ready to move to Ohio for a graduate program at Miami University, and hoping to do work with environmental science, so that way I can go back to my nation and work on revitalization of different habitats that support some of our material culture, like bulrush mat weaving, twine panel bags. So I'm looking at doing a lot of work in research and publication on the topics of revitalization.
Well, that's great. And I hope you keep your journalism hat on though as well. So Valerie, back to you.
Just, is there anything any advice you have for student journalists or students at TCUs? What can they do to exercise, or in Indian country in general, what can we all do to exercise and protect our freedom of speech? And why is that so important?
I think the big part and what moved me forward the most was having that community surrounding my voice. So I think being in community with each other to help uplift our voices is the first part of that. I think it gets really hard to continue to try to fight for your voice if nobody wants to support what you're saying or behind the work that you're doing. And I think something I've been reflecting about since the Supreme Court case and how that impacts the ability to find remedies. A lot of our tribal governments have taken language from the Bill of Rights to include free speech and expression. But what does that look like in our tribal governments if that's abridged? Are there rights to remedies in our tribal constitutions? What does that look like for students at TCUs? Are we able to lobby for some of the laws that might need to be in place to allow students remedies at TCUs? Just kind of thinking about avenues that might be worth people pursuing, that might impact future generations, that might cut off a problem before it exists in a way that we have to think about finding a solution in the middle of it.
Well, thank you, Jared, for joining us today, and to everyone who joined us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Miigwech, and I'm going to turn it back over to Valerie to close it down.
Thank you so much, Jared, for joining us today. And thank you all who are tuning in on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and across social media and across Indian country and around the world. We're so grateful that you're here and joining us. If you appreciate the work that we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us. Thank you again, Jared, for all your hard work and for ensuring that future generations understand why the freedom of speech is so important and ensuring that it continues on at Haskell. Please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Miigwech ahiye.